Today's topic is the transformative power of the Guru. And this subject today is going to be a little different, a little bit more intimate than a normal Sunday talk. So I'll open with a question. How does spiritual transformation take place? Well, spiritual awakening can occur without any preparation. Sometimes one suddenly stumbles upon it, or one chances to meet a holy personality, or it can come after a prolonged period of regular spiritual practice, when one day a wonderful spiritual realm suddenly opens up to us. Or it can be precipitated by a sense of urgency due to a life crisis. Sri Ramakrishna gave the famous example. Once an aspirant asked his guru, "How can God be realized?" And the guru said to him, "Come with me. I will show you how one can experience God." Saying this, he took the disciple to a lake and held his head under the water. After a while, he released the disciple and asked him, "Well, how did you feel?" "I was dying for a breath of air," exclaimed the disciple. And the Guru explained, "When the soul longs and yearns for God like that, then you will know that you do not have long to wait for his vision." Well, that's an uncomfortable truth, but it's the truth. My teacher, Swami Pravrajika, used to tell his monastics, meditate as though death is standing at your back. That brings in the required sense of urgency we need in our meditative life. It focuses the mind. It fuels our desire for God, which is the only way out of suffering in this world. And it quickens our spiritual practice and progress. So human pain and suffering arise from the natural sorrows of life. They don't escape anyone. This tragedy and loss, illness and death, they serve as a lightning rod that forces our mind to become one-pointed and seek its only hopeful and lasting refuge, God, the ultimate reality. So undoubtedly, it is the uncomfortable degree of longing that focuses the mind and propels the devotee forward headfirst into the waters of spiritual life. That is the truth and the secret of spiritual success. That life crisis occurred within me suddenly when I was a freshman in college. My father, whom I was very close to, suddenly passed away at the age of 50. Now, I was a good student with a promising future and life, but suddenly my whole world turned gray. I had been raised a Christian, but when I was 12 years old, my parents had left the church. The minister's wife had just died, yet 6 months later, the minister had remarried. And my parents thought, why are we tithing 10% of our income on a school teacher's salary when the minister is really not focused on his ministry? We can teach our children the stories from the Bible. So my mother was a wonderful storyteller, but I soon outgrew her storytelling. And by the time I entered college in Los Angeles, I was agnostic. But with my father's death, I asked myself again and again the deep question, does death end everything? Is this life all that is? And for me, it was like a mantra, ever present in the background of my mind. Because if indeed this life is all that there is, life seemed flat and purposeless. Now, it so happened that in the late 1960s, comparative religions had just entered the college curriculum throughout the country. And it was the time, because it was the time of the great church exodus in America, when 2/3 of Jews and Christians left their synagogue and their church. Why? Because of distrust for authority, including organized religion and a corrupt government at the time of the Vietnam War. And many young people my age turned to the spiritual traditions of the East, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sufism. Houston Smith's book, The Religions of Man, later entitled The World's Religions, was one of our college texts. And it so happened that Houston Smith was the former president of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis. He was a renowned scholar and thinker of the 20th century. He was also the first president of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis. So through that college text and others, we students were first introduced to a Vedantic approach to Hinduism. But the beauty of our class was that our professor arranged trips to various churches, mosques, synagogues, so we could have firsthand experiences of these traditions on site. And one day he announced, we're going to the Vedanta temple in Hollywood to meet the spiritual grandson of Sri Ramakrishna. Now, from our reading, we knew about Ramakrishna, who was considered an avatar who lived in Calcutta from 1836 to 1886. And we knew about Swami Vivekananda, his foremost disciple, who introduced Vedanta at the World's Parliament, the first World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. And we knew how he had electrified his audience with his message that religion means realization, self-realization, the divinity within every human being, and the harmony of all religions, each tradition being a path to the same goal. And to this day, I vividly remember that when I entered the Vedanta temple in Hollywood, across the hall was my future teacher, seated cross-legged on the shrine dais, giving a Bhagavad Gita class. But when I looked at him, something magical happened. And for the first time in my life, I had come into the presence of holiness. I knew he was a man of God. And by association, I knew religion was true. And the pull of this holy man was so great that I traveled from Los Angeles to the Santa Barbara Vedanta Temple to meet him and the nuns there. Now, the Vedanta Society of Southern California is the largest center in the United States with the largest number of monastics. And at that time, there were 50 monastics, convents, and monasteries in our centers in Hollywood, in Santa Barbara, and in Trabuco Canyon. So driving into the Santa Barbara convent campus for the first time, where there's a beautiful early South Indian temple, it's on 50 acres of land, it's up in the National Forest, and it's 10 minutes from the Pacific Ocean. I was overwhelmed by the feeling that this was my home. But how could that be? After all, I was a political activist at the time, determined to change the world. But within months, that plan would evaporate into thin air. And in the Santa Barbara temple, I was finally to meet the Swami for a private interview for the first time. And his first words to me foretold my future. I want you to be a nun, he said emphatically. Well, how could he know that? Soon after, I moved to Santa Barbara to be near the temple and the convent there, and to finish my last year of college at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And the beauty of that experience was that twice a month, the Swami would come to the Santa Barbara Vedanta Center to give talks and classes, and I would stay in the only convent guest room available, the laundry room, That was where the watchdogs were fed. And being on a property of 50 acres, we had to have watchdogs. But to me, it was heaven on earth. To hear in the convent dining table or on his daily walks, teachings or reminiscences he had received from Sarada Devi herself and from most of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. To me, I had stepped into a living spiritual religion tradition, not something that I read from musty old books, but something that was handed down by word of mouth, and also with a very good literature at the time. So what were some of those reminiscences, previously unrecorded, pearls from an oral tradition? Once the Swami shared, "You have all heard that Sri Ramakrishna worshipped his own picture." Now, most of you have read the life of Sri Ramakrishna, and if you haven't, I urge you to do so. It's an amazing biography, and it's taken from firsthand authentic sources. But nobody knows when and who saw this incident. The Swami went on, "I learned that just before his Mahasamadhi, he had asked Rakal, the future Swami Brahmananda, considered the spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna. He said, bring that picture," meaning his own photo, seated in the meditation, "down." Then he told Rakal, this is Sri Ramakrishna, "Go and gather flowers of all kinds, and as many as you can." Rakal went and brought them. And then Thakur, meaning master, took his own photo and put it on his heart, and then on his forehead, and then on his head. Then he began to worship it with each flower. Some mantras he used, nobody knows what. It took him an hour or so to finish worshiping his own photo. Then he said, "This picture will be worshipped in every home someday." So what does that mean to those of us who heard this? The photo of Sri Ramakrishna is living. Furthermore, as Sri Ramakrishna said, he who is the Ishta appears in the form of the Guru. When the disciple obtains a vision of his chosen ideal, it is really the Guru who appears to him and says, "This is that." That is to say, the Guru points out to the disciple his Ishta. Uttering these words, the Guru disappears into the form of the Ishta. The disciple no longer sees the Guru. There's a beautiful story that illustrates this truth. Jack Mershon, who was a long-time devotee in Santa Barbara and in Hollywood, was one such person. In his youth, he had led a very fast life, and when we met him, he was a recovering alcoholic, devoted to Swami Prabhupada. In the last 3 years of his life, he had a condition of disintegrating discs in his spine, which forced him to sit and sleep in an armchair. He was married to a woman who was also a long-time devotee. One day, Jack asked us nuns for a close-up photo of Sri Ramakrishna's face. We had it framed and we placed it near his armchair. He shared with us, "I speak to him in this photo." One day, sometime later, he said, "Sri Ramakrishna speaks to me." One Christmas Eve, he called us up in the convent and cried, "I have no pain. Sri Ramakrishna has removed it." Finally, the day came when Jack was moved to the hospital, and Sri Ramakrishna's photo went with him. One day, the nurse came to clean his room, and she dusted his bedside table. But Jack said, "Don't move that photo. He's come to take me." The nurse thought nothing, so she went into the bathroom to clean. And when she came out, Jack was gone. Later, she told us, I didn't realize he meant so soon. At other times during Swami's visit to our convent, he would share invaluable truths. One of my senior sisters, Pravrajika was his personal secretary, and she was also a stenographer. And she recorded many, many intimate reminiscences and conversations, and those are published in the book Light to the West in our bookstore. She recorded one such occasion. Swami said, how can any like us claim to understand any of Ramakrishna's disciples? This is Swami Prabhupada speaking. I have known Maharaj, Swami Brahmananda, Swamis Premananda, Turiyananda, and others, and I have served them and received love from all of these. I can't claim to understand them. Knowers of Brahman, Brahm Agyanis, all of them. But then I would say, who cares to understand? To love them is enough. A disciple present then offered, Swami, wouldn't loving them be understanding them? And Swami replied, yes, loving gives the power to understand, but then it is according to one's capacity. So these precious moments are how a sincere aspirant grows in understanding the subtle truths of spiritual life by one's holy reading or sitting at the feet of the Guru, hearing his teachings and then following the advice of Sri Ramakrishna. And we have the wonderful books, the Great Master, the Lila Prasanga, and also the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And his advice specifically, as cows after eating their fill of fodder, lie quietly down at a place and chew the cud, so you must take hold of the holy thoughts, then rise in the mind there, sit down in a solitary spot, and think of them till you become immersed in them. Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. Hearing the truth, meditating on the truth, realizing the truth. To me, at my young age, I was maybe 22, it was in 1971. To me, the most precious time, and I was still a student, was the evening after Arati, when the nuns would gather in the convent living room with their knitting, crocheting, or ghee light preparations to hear the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna read aloud by one of the senior nuns with the Swami present. And that tradition is still carried on today. We would always gather in the living room after Arati and read for 20 minutes from the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It would take us a year to get through the gospel, and then we would start again. And after years of reading and rereading the gospel, something would click, and we would read between the lines of a passage we had heard so many times. And so that is how the spiritual awakening takes place. The gospel passages would spark Swami's memory of his years as a young monk, and he would reminisce about Sarada Devi, the virgin wife of Sri Ramakrishna, and the direct disciples of Ramakrishna he had met. Sometimes intimate reminiscences that until then had never been published. Swami reminisced. Swami Premananda, he was one of the 6 Ishvarakotis of the Ramakrishna incarnation, was the manager of Bellarmont. And he would ask guests to come, so I would have to give up my bed. This is Swami speaking. I was sleeping in the same bedroom with Swami's Subodhananda, a direct disciple of Ramakrishna, whose nickname was Koka Maharaj, which means baby, referring to his childlike nature. And you can read about all of these disciples in the bookstall. We have many books on them. And also Ombikananda and Shankarananda, both disciples of Swami Brahmananda. And Shankarananda later became, in 1951, the 7th president of the Ramakrishna order. One day, Babaram Maharaj brought a guest and told me to find somewhere else to sleep. There were just very, very few beds at Bellarmine at that time. But Koka Maharaj said, Abani, which was Prabhavananda's given name, you come and sleep in my bed. Swami Prabhavananda related, and of course I did. But I couldn't sleep all night, thinking that my feet might touch him. And touching another great soul with your feet is considered a defilement. But I was warm, he said. Swami finished by saying, always, when Maharaj Swami Brahmananda sat on anybody's bed in that room, he sat on Koka Maharaj's bed. You see what intimate memories these old Swamis had of life at Bellarmine with the disciples of Ramakrishna. The following story Swami Prabhavananda shared that he heard directly from Koka Maharaj. Once Swamiji Maharaj and Koka Maharaj shared the same room. Swamiji was meditating, the others were asleep. The Swamiji asked, Koka, are you awake? Can you prepare a chillum of tobacco for me? When Koka had done it, Swamiji was so satisfied. He said, ask a boon of me. Now, Swamiji was an Ishvarakoti, and that meant that these 6 Ishvarakotis came with the incarnation with special powers. And of them all, Swami Vivekananda was the supreme. Koka replied to his brother disciple, why should I accept a boon from you? I have got everything from Thakur, meaning the master, Sri Ramakrishna. Then Maharaj said, Koka, Swamiji is in a mood. Both Swamiji and Maharaj were both Ishvarakotis, and Maharaj could identify the spiritual state Swamiji was in. Ask for something. Then Koka Maharaj said, all right, give me this boon, that wherever I may be, I may have a cup of tea at least once a day. Swamiji said, granted. Swami Prabhavananda then shared with us, once I asked Koka Maharaj, have you always had your tea? He answered, yes, every day. At least before I went to bed at night, I had a cup of tea. Then he said, once in a very strange way, I was walking in the Himalayas. This is Koka Maharaj speaking. It was 8 or 9 in the evening. I saw some Marwari gentlemen seated, and they invited me for a cup of tea. Such was Vivekananda's boon that even when Koka Maharaj was isolated in the Himalayas, his boon for him was destined to be fulfilled. You can imagine the atmosphere in those twilight hours in Santa Barbara would become so rarefied that I would leave for my laundry room bedroom thinking, my God, I'm living within the orbit of an incarnation of God and his disciples. Such is the power of this oral tradition. Those times in the convent with the Swami were what made me a nun. So this is how spiritual awakening sometimes arises within us by lives touching lives. How did the Swami teach us? Through his personal reminiscences of Sri Ramakrishna, Sarada Devi, and the direct disciples, by his love, but also, yes, by his scoldings. When the Swami was no longer able to go to the shrine to meditate, we would meditate in his room with him. He would wave incense around all the holy pictures in his room and then place Mahaprasad in the palms of each one of our hands before we all sat for meditation. And Mahaprasad is the Jagannath Puri Prasad that is considered one of the most vibrant forms of Brahman. And he would sit in his large armchair. And once he explained to us that before he began his meditation, he would mentally revisit certain places of pilgrimage in India where he had received a special darshan. Such a practice as these mental pilgrimages establishes a spiritual mood conducive to meditation. The Swami shared, in Kanjivaram, sister, meaning Sister Lalita, one of the three Mead sisters who helped Vivekananda's work during his second visit to the West. And as many of you may know, he came to stay in the Mead household in southern Pasadena, where Sister also lived with her parents. And that house is a shrine. It's also a cultural landmark in Pasadena. And it's possible for those of you who go to visit our Southern California center to see that landmark. So Sister Lolita and I went to the Shiva temple. Sister was not allowed to enter. She was a Westerner. So while we were in the courtyard, a light came from the temple just to the place where we were standing and struck us. With it, there was a blissful vibration and a sound like a rumble of thunder. Both of us saw the light and felt a blissful presence. I walked in the path of the light to the temple, all the time feeling that blissful shock. Swami Prabhavananda also described his darshan inside the Jagannath temple in Puri in March 1936. He only related it to us monastics. He never told it publicly, but just before his passing, he instructed his editor to put it in as an example in his commentary on the Narada Bhakti Sutras without his name attached to it, simply a disciple of Maharaj. One of the priests was our guide, he told us. In order to enter the innermost shrine, one has to go by a passage to the left of the shrine inside the huge temple. As we were about to enter this passage, I suddenly heard a sound like that of thunder coming to strike me. I must admit here, Swami explained, that I was not approaching the shrine with any special reverence or devotion. Indeed, I was rather dry in my heart. For a moment, as the thunder actually struck me, I was terrified, but I had no time to go on being afraid, for I lost consciousness. I faintly heard my brother disciple, Swami Nirvanananda, also a disciple of Maharaj, asking the priest to take hold of my left arm. He himself was already holding my right arm. After they had taken my arms, I was not conscious that anyone was supporting me. I must have had a little consciousness left in me, though I was not aware who I was or where I was. I felt intoxicated as if I had drunk bottles of wine, and I remember I was dragging my feet. Then, as I came nearer to the sanctum sanctorum, there arose within me, in English, the word God, 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 although my mother tongue is Bengali. Then a thrill passed through my whole being, and as I entered into the inner shrine, I became completely unconscious of the external world. All I had was an awareness that I was experiencing a vision which suddenly opened up. I do not know if my eyes were open or closed. I did not see the shrine with walls around me, nor did I see the crowd of pilgrims who must have been there, nor did I see the images of the deities in the shrine. I only saw an ocean of light and waves of bliss striking me, which increased in intensity and beggared all description. I do not know how long I was in the shrine, But I do remember that when I was brought out of the shrine and stood in the open courtyard of the temple, I felt that I was being held by my arms. I then stood up straight and shook myself free. Much later, I asked my brother disciple, who had been an attendant of Swami Brahmananda, how he knew that I was about to lose consciousness. He simply replied, I lived a long time with Maharaj. That's how I know. Swami Prabhavananda had counseled us to always remain quiet for about 30 minutes after meditation, as that is the time when the mind is relaxed and when spiritual experience sometimes takes place. But he would teach us, in spiritual life, there are mystics and non-mystics. I am a mystic, but Swami so-and-so, referring to a Swami with whom he was very close to, he is an Advaitin who will have the highest experience at the end of his life. Then he would say, look at Pravrajika. She was our Mother Superior, the head of the convent. See her strength of character. That is the true test of spirituality. He would encourage us again and again to make meditation the core of our spiritual life. In the Santa Barbara convent, it was our practice to meditate 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening. Meditation and japa in both our temple and little shrine. That is the only Vedanta center I know that had 2 worships going on every day, in our public temple and in our little shrine, the heart of the convent. Meditation and japa, puja in both our temple and little shrine. And for some of us, Purusharana were disciplines he described. And you may be aware that Puruscharan is acceleration and de-acceleration according to the phases of the moon, starting out with 1,000 japa a day and accelerating to 15,000 at full moon, and then de-escalating to 1,000 again. And that practice taking place usually over a year, sometimes 3 years, sometimes longer. But always one had to ask permission to go onto any particular sadhana, because not everyone had the capacity to endure certain disciplines. But indeed, loving the Guru was a practice that became second nature to us. Swami Prabhavananda had such a strong presence that our minds were naturally uplifted and always riveted to him whenever he came to the Santa Barbara convent. Swami taught us how to study the scriptures by relating what Swami Turiyananda had taught him when he asked how to study the Bhagavad Gita. Turiyananda Swami said, take one verse at a time, meditate on its meaning, and live that verse for a week before going on to the next verse. And that way, he was to study the entire Gita. And when we study in this way, what happens? The verse becomes our teacher. By living it, we begin to imbibe it and ultimately embody it. It begins to change our behavior and modify our mind. And that is how we grow in spiritual life. This is a proactive spiritual practice. Swami also taught by scolding, and there was no one who could scold more loudly than Swami. He used to explain, when Maharaj was disciplining us, he was removing karmas. For 3 months in Madras, he scolded me, whether I was sitting or standing. So this scolding is part of the Ramakrishna tradition. Even when I was in my bed at night, he would send for me. But when he scolded, he gave me the power to bear it. And I was a boy. My parents were careful to never scold. I could not stand harsh words. When we asked Swami why he scolded, sometimes so publicly, he would say, it makes a deeper impression. And also, he said, it removes karmas. He could see our faults and cut at the core. Often, I would hear him randomly quote, within earshot from the Old Testament, for whom the Lord loves, he chasteneth. So in a sense, these scoldings helped us to remove months of struggle, but they were harsh. They were extremely harsh. When Swami would come to Santa Barbara, there were always teaching moments in his presence. In the convent living room, there are large windows. Some of you have visited our Santa Barbara Center. Large windows that look up to the San Ynez Mountains. And just below the mountains is the temple. So Santa Barbara Center is on 50 acres. 12 are cultivated. It's up in the national forest and it's 10 minutes from the Pacific Ocean. So these picture windows were looking up at the San Ynez Mountains. And the nuns would clean these windows as part of the convent's bi-monthly maintenance schedule. To one nun who was diligently performing this task, he came up behind her and gently asked, are you doing your japam? And yet to another, he stood before the window and with a wave of his arm, he declared, referring to the view, all this is Brahman. Gardening was one of our spiritual disciplines in the Santa Barbara convent. Every day we would spend an hour in the garden because, as Swami explained, it makes one honest. And needless to say, he learned this from his master. Wherever Swami Brahmananda went to stay, he established a garden and made gardening a discipline for the monks there. So when we would go to pick flowers for worship, Swami would remind us, don't overpick the garden, for here in the garden, there is a cosmic worship going on all the time. So you can imagine how many flowers we would have to pick for 2 worships in our public temple and in our little shrine where we did both Sri Ramakrishna's worship and Sarada Devi's worship. But we never overpicked. One would need to live with a guru to receive his or her, one need not live with a guru to receive his or her blessings. It's miraculous how, after initiation, the guru lives in the heart of the devotee, whether one knows it or not. In this connection, one of the most graphic examples of spiritual transformation I had the privilege to witness was Tim, a young interior decorator who lived close to the temple in Santa Barbara. His life was an inspiring example to me of the story Sri Ramakrishna used to tell of the disciple who asked his guru how God can be realized. And then when the guru took the disciple to a lake and held his head under the water. And after a few moments, when the disciple surfaced, asking him, how did you feel? And the disciple saying, oh, I thought I should die. I was panting for breath. And the teacher said, when you feel like that for God, then you will know you haven't long to wait for his vision. So Tim used to frequent our bookstore in Santa Barbara in order to buy Objet d'Art and other gifts for his friends. We have a book department and also a non-book department. And we would have orders from the East Coast because we had a large collection of statues, rosaries, and so on and so forth. Not just from our tradition, but from other traditions as well. At that time, he was not interested in the temple or Vedanta, but he liked the nuns, and he would visit with us in the bookstore. But suddenly, he stopped coming. Then weeks later, I saw Tim near the temple, and I asked him, Why haven't we seen you these past weeks? And he said, I've been diagnosed with AIDS. At that time, it was the 1980s, and AIDS patients underwent a social death long before their physical death. They were shunned by society. We were one of the only churches in California, Southern California, that I know of, that held memorial services for AIDS patients. We saw Tim's life slowly beginning to change. It was a painful 3-year transition period. He began to come to the bookstore to buy books on Ramakrishna and to get Ganges water instead of gifts for his friends. He would then enter the temple to sit in silence for short periods of time. Then again, Tim stopped coming. This time, he had been hospitalized, where he was sorely neglected, and then he was released. One day, Tim asked me about the practice of the mantra. And so I told him about Swami Swanand, who was the founder of this center when he was the successor to Swami Prabhupada. He was then the spiritual head of the Vedanta Center, and he was the initiating guru who gave the sacred mantra to sincere seekers. I then requested Swami Swanand on behalf of Tim, and he summoned Tim to the monastery and initiated him there. Again, a period of time went by, and we did not see Tim. When he finally came to the temple, he told us that he had been hospitalized and had been near death. The nurses had mistreated him. There was so much fear about AIDS at that time. I told him, "You're fortunate now to have a guru." Tim replied, "My disease is my guru. All my friends have left me. They're afraid to touch me or even be near me." By learning firsthand such a profound and painful lesson about the transient nature of the world, Tim's renunciation began to turn his mind inward, and he then began to come to the temple once a week, then twice a week, then every day to meditate. The special birthday celebration of Ramakrishna came, and Tim asked us if he could decorate the shrine in the temple for the public celebration. We said yes, and it was beautifully done. Tim used his natural talent as an interior decorator to worship his Lord for this special religious celebration. Not long after, Tim was hospitalized for the last time, and one morning we got the call from the nurses to come. When a senior nun and I arrived, his room was filthy with a stench of disease and blood-stained pads and syringes lying about. It was obvious he had been neglected. Tim was semi-conscious. The senior nun who was with me announced sweetly, "Tim, Sri Ramakrishna has come to take you. We have brought you Ganges water." And being a devotee of Ganges, he opened his mouth. It seemed as though Tim was such a striking example of the disciple in the lake, gasping for air as the Ganges water was carefully placed in his mouth. How he had yearned for God these last 3 years of his life. Then Tim became still. As is our custom, we began to chant the name of the Lord aloud. And at the bedside of one who is dying, it's always Hari Om Ramakrishna. The morning nurses entered. Seeing us there, they quickly cleaned Tim's room, smiled at us, and then left out of respect. There was a palpable sense of urgency. in the room. After 10 minutes, Tim's mouth began to move. He was softly chanting the name of the Lord along with us. We moved from the foot of the bed to the side of his bed, and we saw tears beginning to trickle down from the outer corners of Tim's eyes. Tears of repentance come from the inside corners of the eyes, but tears of bliss flow from the outer corners. Suddenly, in a semi-ecstatic state, with tears flowing from his eyes, Tim lifted himself up to turn his bliss-filled gaze on us with eyes that could not physically see and a blissful smile bathed his face. My senior sister and I were both overcome by this sight, and we quickly left the room. But I somehow managed to compose myself and then re-entered his room to softly say goodbye. Tim was quiet, indrawn, tears still trickling down his face. The turmoil was gone. 10 minutes later, the hospital called us to say that Tim had passed away. Our life experience, no matter how sorrowful, can also manifest as our guru like no other. Life's tragedy can awaken such yearning within the disciple that call for release from sorrow unties all the knots of the heart and allows the guru's power to manifest. I'd like to end with another beautiful story of how the guru comes. It was a story Swami Swanand often loved to relate to us. Swami Subodhananda, who was one of the direct disciples of Ramakrishna, Koka Maharaj, had a disciple called Kushum, a child widow, very devoted to her guru, who lived in Ranchi, in the Ranchi area. Whenever Swami Subodhananda was in that area, she'd serve him devotedly. When she was a little over 40 years old, she became ill and died. At the time of her death, her neighbor thought she saw a light coming from her house. Swami Subodhananda also had an intimation that she had passed away. Some time passed. Then Swami Subodhananda fell ill and developed a high fever. Suddenly he found Kushum fanning him by his bedside. "How did you come?" he asked, remembering she'd passed away some time before. "Thakur," meaning the master, Sri Ramakrishna, "sent me," she said. Then Swami Subodhananda asked, "What happened the day you passed away?" She told him, "I was in such pain and prayed to you very earnestly. Suddenly my body lightened, and you came to take me. We went along a lighted path for a long time. Your head was covered by a cloth chadar. Then I came to a beautiful place. You removed the cloth from your head, and instead of you, it was Thakur, laughing. I asked what happened to my guru, and Thakur answered, it was I all the time, but you kept asking for your guru, so I had to take that form." Swami Swanand would then explain, Sri Ramakrishna pointed out how at the time of realization, the guru becomes one with the Ishta. In other words, and this is his words, the Ishta, when manifested, is the guru. After the human guru passes away, you may think The Guru has not left me. The Guru has become more infinite, more cosmic. The Guru is part of the Ishta. No matter what our life experiences, the pleasure or unbearable pain they bring, so long as we hold on to the feet of the Guru, these experiences can become our sadhana that refashion the mind in such a way that they remake it into a fit and purified receptacle to receive the divine presence of the Guru, who is one with God. And so, with a living oral tradition that exists in the Ramakrishna order, we all can still feel the warmth that radiates from the spiritual fire generated by that God-man Ramakrishna, who walked this earth, his direct disciples, and those blessed monastics and lay disciples who had the rare fortune to witness their lives and then share their firsthand memories in a precious oral tradition whose darshan continues to recharge us and inspire us today, and indeed make us feel we are the inheritors of a special grace. Swami Brahmananda explained, within the palace of 7 gates there dwells a king, with whom a poor man begs an audience. The king's minister grants his request and leads him through the gates to the royal presence. At each gate there stands a richly dressed officer, and each time the poor man asks the minister if that is the king. The minister answers no each time until they have passed the 7th gate and the king stands before them in all his splendor and beauty. Then no question is asked. The man recognizes his king. So it is with the Guru. Like the king's minister, he leads the disciple through the different stages of spiritual unfoldment until he leaves them with the Lord.